welcome to Build Back Better. Why Building Back Better is the only option, rather. In Stories After Ida, we'll be talking about our experiences over the last 2 weeks and using that to catalyze us into action and to get our legislators to finally, hopefully, start listening to us as we are in this timely moment of the budget reconciliation bill, which I'm sure all of us have been hearing about, and we'll talk more about throughout the call later on tonight. And I am going to keep talking while silencing my phone. And feel free to pop in questions throughout the conversations that we have tonight. If you're confused on anything, we'll be trying to marry the actions and the priorities that we see in this moment with our stories. And so we're trying to give everyone the tools they need and the template they need to successfully share their story and ask their congressional leaders to take action in this moment. And so our agenda for tonight looks like this. We're going to, of course, have this quick tech catch-up session and a grounding of where we are in this moment. And then we will give space to what we said we were here for, which is storytelling and sharing out. And then we will have the fabulous Logan Burke of Alliance for Affordable Energy talking about clean electricity standard. And for folks that are not speaking right now, please make sure to mute. And then I'll also walk us through the campaign that Delta Chapter was working on in coalition with others prior to Hurricane Ida, and our own story kind of shifting and expanding in this moment. And then, of course, we'll make some space and time with some good music to take action and close out. I try not to keep my folks long, and I try to get through an effective hour as concisely and productively as possible. And so your speakers tonight, so I've already mentioned Logan. She is with the Alliance for Affordable Energy and is the executive director. We'll also hear from Charles Barjon. If you want to give a wave, Charles. Logan is right here next to me in my photos, but maybe not for you guys. So she's waving to y'all. And Charles Barjon is a senior at Southern University in Baton Rouge, and he is a Sierra Student Coalition leader, and his pronouns, of course, he, him, his. And email is 771alliance@gmail.com. And then your co-facilitators this time, which is always fun for me, is me. So I'm Angel, pronoun she, her, hers, and I'm with the Sierra Club Delta chapter. I am the Sierra student liaison and works with the Grassroots Network, mostly on transit equity and waste reduction. And then my twin sister, whose email address I left a question mark for, my bad. I will add that later, and you will see the updated email address for her. And Kate, I don't know if you want to hop on and say your title with Earthworks. Or if you can.
Yes, certainly. Caitlin Joshua with Earthworks, y'all. She, her, hers pronouns. I'm the Gulf Coast campaigner for Earthworks.
All right, guys. And I'm going to give space now to Charles Barjon, who's our first speaker. He and I are both going to be leaning into what is it like to basically be climate organizing amid a climate crisis, which a lot of us are experiencing right now. Charles, I'll spotlight you and the floor is yours.
All right. So I'm going to be talking about my experience within Hurricane Ida. I wrote something down briefly, so I'm going to read through that and then add as it comes to me. And I hope everyone's having a good night, by the way. I'm Charles Barjon, president of the 771 Alliance. I'm a senior at Southern University studying history. And faith, fear, and clarity were born out of my experience recently surviving Hurricane Ida. Faith because, as one could imagine, an experience living during a natural disaster would cause any living being to cast worries onto their creator or belief system. So in my life, prayer and patience were strengthened in that time because long hours were spent just doting around in the darkness and in the heat without air conditioning. Fear, though, was the direct result of my ignorance. Although I've been in Louisiana for 4 years here at Southern University, this hurricane was the first one within this time span that actually affected me. I was in New Orleans without power for days. I was there with my grandparents, my 70-year-old grandparents, so the heat was eventually getting to my grandmother. Actually, we had to find some Tylenol or something like that within the house just to ease her headache, and just drive around the neighborhood where we could, where it was safe, just to get out of that heat from the house. Because at the end of the day, it was cooler outside than it was inside. But back to my script before I ramble on too much. It was days without power. I was there stuck on top of my car, surrounded by floodwater, trying to get back to Southern University. and just sitting here on top of my car, wondering why I, from California, am sitting in the middle of floodwater in Louisiana. Um, and really, again, going back to faith and praying and really hoping to get off that car eventually. And my last experience from this all was clarity, because from all of this fear and this and uncertainty came the clear thought of infrastructure and disaster relief. So our transportation isn't limited when we're in these situations. So people do not have to suffer and sit in darkness and in extreme heat and have to wait for long periods of time before they can find some sort of relief. Clarity came from all of this, from my lived experience within all of this. And that's all I really have to share, is really just those three things. Faith, fear, and clarity came out of Hurricane Ida for me personally. And yeah, the floor is yours, Angel.
How did Hurricane Ida affect climate organizing for students?
Well, so for students, so that's another issue. For a lot of students, especially here at Southern University, we're not students from Louisiana. We're what you call out-of-state students. So for a lot of us, if we did evacuate back home, we're still there. If you are stuck at Southern University, you know how to deal with whatever happened structurally to Southern University. So organizing was paused and put at a halt. Within my own organization, we started having some sort of momentum coming through. The 771 Alliance, plans in place, ideas for first general body meetings. Pre-law society, we actually had to move the date of our first meeting. So organizing within the grassroots level at college campuses were severely, I'd say, interrupted. I say severely because, as we know in activism, momentum is a very strong component, and it helps a lot when you're trying to organize people and organize thoughts. So when you're stunted or you have a brief hiccup, that brief hiccup is actually an avalanche in many cases. But that's the importance of why we're here today, and why there is no better time but to build back and build out now, and to think out these ideas. And it's a really good thing that we're all here together tonight, to think these ideas out together, because it's going to help the future of Louisiana, and more than just Louisiana, but this Gulf Coast that we all love.
All right, y'all. So storytelling is what Louisianans do best. We share, we comfort one another through story and song, and we want to really start to think about how do we get our stories and our reflections to really lead us to take action. So for over a year now, we've all heard the phrase "Build Back Better," but what does that even look like for us? We spend so much time navigating crisis after crisis. Building something better next time can mean so many different things for different people. So how do we hone in on a better meaning on our best? How do we build back in the best forms? And how do we get our leaders to relay what we envision as better and act upon that vision? We're going to take about 10 to 15 minutes to just talk out what we have gone through and what we are driven to do as a result of these experiences. We want to ask ourselves, how was Hurricane Ida, or the last year's climate events in general, for folks that weren't necessarily directly impacted by Hurricane Ida? How has this last year been a game changer for us? What emotions show up for us? What actions do we want to see taken to address the climate crisis? And when our leaders say build back better, what do you actually want them to commit to? So take a minute, think on these questions. But a lot of times, of course, many of us who care about the climate don't always take time to figure out what do we actually want. We know what we dislike, but we want to know what we want. Margie, are you ready to speak?
Okay, took me a minute to find the right button. Yes, y'all can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Yeah, I'm over in Lacombe on the North Shore now, but I'm a native of New Orleans. And I have been through so many hurricanes in my life, I can't even name them all. But the ones that I remember are Betsy, Camille, and of course, Katrina was probably the next big nasty. And then Ida. And Ida, I was out of New Orleans for Katrina. So I didn't have to deal directly. I did with friends and family, but directly with all the flooding. But over here on the North Shore, the tree damage and the wires down and the infrastructure damage is just unbelievable. I just got electricity back day before yesterday, and internet is still spotty. But I noticed that as I'm getting older, it's harder. And what Charles was saying about his parents or grandparents, I forget which it was, but the older people, it is really much harder now than it used to be to deal with everything, to deal with the stresses. And I think our older populations, and especially people who are in poverty situations, desperately need to be helped, because when you can't afford to just go hire somebody to clean up your yard and take tree limbs off your house or repair roofs and things like that, that makes it even so much more critical and hard on people. And you know, when you're younger, you can do it yourself and you have friends maybe get it done, but as you get older, your friends are also older, and it's really hard. And I realize now how much harder it is on older people. And like I say, those without the funds to try to pay somebody to get things done, it's really the prices for everything is just unbelievable. And I didn't deal so much with fear because I've been through so many and I'm kind of used to it. But it is terrifying when you're hearing trees snapping and breaking around your home, and you know you don't have any power, and it's a a terrifying experience. And the sad thing is, I have solar panels. I have 24 panels, and after the storm, if I could afford a Tesla wall battery or something, I could have been generating my own power and actually had power at my house the day after the storm. But because of the way the system is set up, I have to be tied into the CLECO system, and I have to have electricity coming from them before my solar panels will work. And that is ridiculous and sad. And the fact that I could have had electricity the day after the storm is very frustrating. You know, I had to sit here for almost 2 weeks without electricity. So working on infrastructure where individual homes can have panels and also have energy even when storm damage has happened to the system, to the grid, and helping people, older people, everyone needs help, but older people, I do realize now, are hit a lot harder. And when I was younger, you know, you don't tend to think that way, but it's like, yeah, it's much harder on me now than it was 20 years ago. And but I think what we're doing here is very important to try to help so many people to get through things like this, and to get the politicians to pay attention and do what needs to be done to help people get through this.
Jahi, you're good to unmute.
Good afternoon, everybody. So thank you all for making this space to create a space for storytelling. I would have to say that for Hurricane Ida, it was the first major storm that I think I experienced in many, many years. But with the pandemic creating so much uncertainty for me, it just felt like the hurricane intensified my anxiety and my fears, because we're already living in a state of such uncertainty. And then when you add a hurricane to that, it's almost like the uncertainty just kind of compounded. It was so nerve-wracking for me that I actually had an emotional breakdown. I was on the phone crying like crazy the day before the hurricane hit, because there was just so much emotion that I was feeling, you know, like realizing I would have to leave because I wasn't sure how the storm would impact my community, and then having to think about the fact that I didn't have enough money to leave. So luckily I was able to go to my mom's house in Mississippi and take my grandmother with me. But I thought about the fact that, you know, if I didn't have that resource, then I would have been in a much more precarious position. And I was very blessed to be with my family and to return home to a home, my grandmother as well. And I didn't have power for several days, but eventually things slowly came back to some kind of quasi normal for me. And it's almost seems, you know, like it just seems like contradictory to say normal, because nothing is normal. We're not living in normal times at all. I mean, I'm just thinking about the fact that we dealt with a category 4 hurricane in the midst of a global pandemic. So there is no going back to normal. But as I reflect on just this storm and the aftermath, I have a lot of anger, honestly, because of the fact that so much devastation has, you know, we've experienced as a result of climate change intensifying these storms. has come because the environment is being destroyed. And in a more dark way, I always think of the fact that, Louisiana's environment is being destroyed by companies who are based here economically, but not based here with their heart and soul, destroying our water and our air. And we can't even benefit from it financially. So it's like we're a poor state. We can't even benefit from this, which is, and on top of that, none of the companies who are polluting our communities are even extending a helping hand to help us with the recovery. So that's one thing that I feel. And I also feel a lot of despondency because at the end of the day, despite our racial, ethnic, and political differences as Louisianians, these are still my people. And so to see the devastation and to see the communities that are in this region suffering and struggling, I wonder what's going to happen next. What will recovery look like? Will recovery be the recovery that we need? It's just, again, a lot of uncertainty. And I'm also feeling a sense of survivor's guilt because the worst thing that I experienced was throwing out my groceries and waiting in a long line for gas and not having power for a day and a half. But my life eventually got back to normal. The gas lines got shorter. I've had power for a week. I was able to fill up my fridge. But I'm also thinking about the people who are not in that position. There are people who still haven't come home yet, wondering if they'll have a home to come to. There are people who are permanently displaced because of this hurricane. And for me, I just feel as though I'm blessed, but I also do again have that survivor's guilt. And when I think about this whole idea of Build Back Better and what needs to be done to address the climate crisis, I honestly think that an intersectional approach is very much important. It's climate change doesn't impact people equally. Wealthy people are going to be more resilient and more able to deal with climate change than poor people. You have to address institutional racism and how oftentimes environmental degradation impacts Black, Latino, Asian, and Indigenous people much more harshly than it would impact suburbanites. And we also need to keep in mind that just the whole infrastructure of America is connected to institutional racism. So any change that is designed to confront climate change needs to address institutional racism, and it can't be a quick fix because we've desecrated Mother Earth for decades. So we need to invest in a long-term plan to at least deal with what we're dealing with as far as this climate, because we can't go back, but how do we move forward? That's the question. So yeah, I would have to say that I am very disheartened, despondent, but I'm also trying to stay encouraged because I hope that this, like Katrina, will be a breaking point for our community to actually demand climate justice for our community.
Yeah. Thank you, Jahi. Renee, you will be our next speaker. You'll be our final speaker, but I did put in the chat, y'all, there will be more time for reflection. We'll get through a little bit more content from me and Logan around the bills themselves and what we're pushing for. And then we'll come back to more time for writing and reaching out to our leaders. So Renee, you are good to speak.
Hi, everybody. I live here in Baton Rouge, and we were clipped on the east side by this storm. The forecast had originally said it was going to go to our west, and we would have been on the worst side of it. I want to also say that I appreciate some of the comments y'all have been making around people who are too poor to leave. I'm one of those people who are too attached to their animals, who would not leave their animals in peril and go seek safety. Also, like I started to speak on it first, the uncertainty of the past of these hurricanes, and it's going to get more and more like that, more and more intense, larger, more dangerous storms, more vicious, more widespread in the bad effects. This storm went all the way up to New York and killed more people up there than it killed down here. We can't afford to if you can't afford to leave at all, you certainly can't afford to race back and forth across the Gulf Coast states trying to figure out where safety would be. So I think that, and I'm going to speak to something else Jahi talked about, these corporations that make all this money off of the very, very vast richness of the natural resources of the state of Louisiana, where we don't even have a universal basic income for the state. They can afford to do that. We can afford for that. There needs to be some shame attached to this unbridled greed and this disrespect and disinterest and disregard for our natural safety, for the natural environment. And I would like to see, I'm a big train person. Y'all don't know that, but I'm a big train person. And I think we need passenger trains. Angela's been hearing me yell about that. So that's my big thing. I want to see less traffic on these dangerous highways. I just read the other day where somebody was trying to come home from having evacuated and was killed on the highway. That's already a stressful situation, especially I-10. Yeah, that's the worst place in the universe. And I just think that we need less traffic on the highways. So I won't take too much time. That's not eloquently said, but I hope I made some good points.
You are always eloquent, so
You're sweet.
no self-deprecating. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to share my screen again, y'all. Give me one sec. Yep. Okay. So we're going to shift gears a bit. We have a story. We all are starting to reflect on where we are in this moment and what brought us to this moment. And so the question just becomes, how can we take action now? My story, and for a lot of the Delta chapter and in coalition with others, began with collective and people-led efforts to get Louisiana's leaders to take seriously preventative, not just responsive measures to address the climate crisis. And so our energy had been focused, along with Alliance for Affordable Energy and 771 Alliance and Earthworks, has been around the 3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill. I'm sure tons of us have heard about it, and it gets messy following it every single day. But the most important thing to know for this week, and the reason why we have this tonight, even when it's not even ideal in this moment, right? Like, we're still recovering, and it was hard for us to decide to do tonight, but we wanted to give everyone the space and the time to reach out to your congressional leaders before the potential September 15th deadline for the budget reconciliation bill's language and amount. And so while many of you might have seen the news around Joe Manchin and his pushback on the budget reconciliations amount, the 3.5 trillion, we still know we need to get our leaders from Graves to Scalise and Cassidy and Kennedy to know what we think and what we need in this moment of recovery as they talk about the budget reconciliation bill. And so the most aggressive timeline has that deadline as September 15th, but then between the Senate and the House, there's kind of this fuss over the final deadline being September 27th. And so while we'll do our best to keep you posted on which one actually becomes the deadline, we'll keep operating within the vein that this week is a really important week, y'all. So when marrying our stories with an ask, especially amid congressional recess, we want to be clear with our ask and honest with our story. The Delta chapter story has centered around 4 demands of the Fair Access Ride Equity campaign and has now expanded to include the 100% clean electricity standard, which Logan will speak on extensively. I'm going to take us through the FAIR campaign. That launched, I don't even know how many weeks ago that was at this point. So that launched August 18th. And it really was just about seeing public transportation, as Renee was saying, as something that can connect our state. As a solution for the climate crisis, we can reduce carbon emissions, and it's an opportunity for workers to have good pay, union workers, right? And of course, above anything else, we want safety to be at the center. And then of course, climate change and workers. And so when we launched this efforts, honestly, what was a huge refrain for us was that public transportation needed to be ubiquitous. So it needed to be everywhere for every Louisianan to participate in. And now, more than ever, we recognize the role that these systems could have played in past evacuation efforts and safe, reliable ways for folks to get out of parishes that were in the path of hurricanes and major storms. We have to build best, not just better, and with these infrastructural concerns in mind. And so I'll walk you through the 4 demands, but I'll be rather quick. The demands that we were asking or making rather was first that any federal infrastructure and transportation funding, so whether it was the budget reconciliation bill, whether it was or is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, whether it was just money that we apply for at the parish and local levels to the federal government, that money centers underserved or environmental justice communities first and prioritize and considered electrification and moving the most people and connecting them to services and goods. I do talk fast. I have been reminded that I talk too fast. do get pieces of paper or put this somewhere. The next demand was that that our transit systems be fully assessed. So have the transit systems, and there's not a lot in Louisiana. And so that's kind of a blessing because you have a blank slate. Has the promises made by parishes and transit systems, have they actually been met? Are they maximizing the implementation of micro mobility structures and increasing the funding sources for transit? And so that's tangible ask for our congressional leaders. We need money for public transportation, and we need to be clear where that money goes and how it's used. The last two demands, priority must be given to the maintenance of current roads, bridges, and highways. And this means that as far as the mega projects and all the other ideas that legislators at the state level may fuss about every single year, we know expansion projects do not help with traffic. We know expansion projects only encourage more driving. And honestly, in this climate change moment, we need more people off the road. And we're not going to do that by having more and more mega projects that are not about electrification and moving the most people. And also, we're not only stuck on rail, we love it, but we know buses are important too for connecting people on the micro level. So multimodal and electric options that would better serve the public must be considered first, and not always throwing money towards concrete and more expansions. And finally, we want our federal officials to make sure in the budget reconciliation bill that the Garcia amendments, so these were amendments that were discussed earlier this year at the federal level, but weren't included, I think, in the bipartisan framework or the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And so we want to see them in the reconciliation package. And basically, it's just about increasing transit funding by 2.5 times. It's about environmental justice, labor, and equity standards, serving as a set of guidelines for Louisiana and other states, addressing all pollution sources and all types of pollution, not just carbon emissions. And then finally, the inclusion of a public transit electrification amendment and a commitment to getting all current and future public transit retrofitted and electrified by 2030. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Logan.
Hey, folks. So this thing is chock full of opportunities for clean energy. And also things that some of us don't particularly agree are clean, but I'm going to talk about the good things for now, and then we can maybe talk about the not so great things later. But the things that I really want to underscore here are incredibly powerful and also represent some big wins that have been going on in DC. So in particular, there's something called the Clean Energy Performance Program, and it's 150 billion. I mistyped when I said million there. It's a billion from the Department of Energy, and these are incentives to move utilities to increasing amounts of clean energy. This might sound familiar to you if you've ever heard of a renewable portfolio standard. This is an incentive and a disincentive kind of wrapped up into one. Rather than a mandate, it's an incentive to move utilities to adopt more solar and wind and other renewable energies. It also does include the nuclear assets, but not new nuclear. It also does not include new natural gas. That was a big question for a while when a lot of this was being discussed. Whether natural gas would be considered clean. We are happy to say that that does not currently include natural gas. There will also be disincentives, effectively penalties, if utilities do not do this work. And this particular program, this is just one program that is expected to add about 8 million jobs by 2030. And remember, this is just the one that's focused on utilities. There's a whole heap of other programs and opportunities that I really want to talk about here that are about what people can do, what communities have opportunities to do if this bill is passed. Can you go to the next slide?
Yes,
While we're waiting for the next slide, I also want to tell you about a bunch of dollars that are set aside specifically that are not associated with this slide, but that I didn't get to make before this meeting. That it adds up to about $35 billion. This is a program that includes $9 billion for energy efficiency in homes, $9 billion for electrification, that is getting away from gas in our homes for heating and for hot water heating. There's also $3.5 billion for weatherization assistance programs. That's a big chunk, more than we usually use for this program that's intended specifically for low income customers. And then there's a ton of money for community solar, for low income solar. And the other exciting thing here is that many of these programs, where they're effectively grant programs for anybody who can apply, a lot of the kind of packages that you can get as a homeowner or even for rental properties are doubled if you fall under what's considered low to moderate income. And so that means it's intended to not just dole out money for folks who already have capital to put solar on their rooftops. It's intended to help get a lot of these programs and dollars into homes and communities that historically haven't been able to access them. And that is actually the next slide that I want to show you. So this is something that is very different. So historically, we've only had a couple of programs in the country that really have pushed the extension or the expansion of solar and wind. And they're typically referred to as the investment tax credit, the ITC, or the production tax credit, which is the PTC. And many of those traditionally are for very large scale projects. But the ITC, if you have solar on your rooftop now, you have access to that investment tax credit. The trouble is, unless you have a large tax liability, it can be very difficult for you to have access to those programs. And so traditionally, again, this has been a barrier to folks who don't have high incomes, don't have high tax liabilities. And so there's something that has to be done here that we're really specifically asking to add to this package. And that is to make the program direct pay for investment tax credits. The direct payment means that you don't have to have that large tax liability. It acts like a rebate. And this is the kind of thing that will unlock so many more programs, so many more options, not just for solar on your rooftop, but to go back to what Margie was talking about for storage. Because we know that there are thousands of Louisianans, for example, who have solar on their rooftops. There are millions of Americans who have solar on their rooftop. But when it comes to the grid going down, unless you've got energy storage that looks like battery typically, it means you can't take advantage of the solar that's installed. And so we need direct pay for both solar and also for storage. And that's something that we really need to push our decision makers to do. We know that especially in these states that are experiencing, whether it's hurricanes or ice storms, or maybe it's wildfires out in California, we know that solar plus storage is going to be a huge part of the solution, not just for major events, but also to keep our bills low from month to month, even in normal situations. But we must make sure that these programs are equitable and accessible to everyone. Otherwise, what we will get is a very inequitable transition to clean energy, and that won't work. I want to stop there and see, I noticed there are things happening in the chat that I haven't been able to respond to. The answer to Raymond's question, utilities will receive money under the Clean Energy Payment Program that will go to whether they are investor-owned utilities, that will also go to municipal utilities and cooperatively owned utilities. But it's important to know, and this is why organizations like the Alliance are watching those books, where the utilities get those kinds of grants, that should be, if watched properly, that should be a reduction in the cost to the utility grid upgrades that otherwise ratepayers would pay, like all of us. And so hopefully, and this is one of those things that we really have to push, have to make sure that our decision makers ensure that those dollars are a reduction to what we would otherwise pay, not just additional profit in the utility pocketbook. I absolutely agree that not all sources of energy are clean. And that is one of the reasons that, for example, the Alliance is not particularly supportive of new nuclear, and existing nuclear is also a real problem for a lot of communities that are dealing with the waste. And so unfortunately, these packages, as we understand them, would support existing nuclear, but would not support new nuclear.
So now's action time. And we're going to be doing two things. Everyone take a deep breath. We are going to get on Twitter and we're going to send emails. I have the email addresses for some of the folks for each of the leaders, but I found more, so I'm going to add that while we're tweeting. And so Kate, if you're good to lead the tweet part, then I'll flip over to my other laptop and add the rest of the email addresses that we can use. But we're going to email congressional leaders with our actual emails instead of using the form. And this week we have 3 meetings. I think it's 2 on the calendar, 1 pending with the federal leaders or their staff. It's actually their staff this week. And I'll get back to that. I'll circle back to the timing for that. And we're also going to tweet our officials about what we want to see with the hashtags Build Back Better and Hurricane Ida. And I need to add the handles for our other organizations on the call with us. And so let me come back to the email. Let's start with Twitter. Kate, can you lead that?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, y'all. So this is the exciting part we get to do together. So as the screen says, actions were taken together. We're going to tweet to our federal officials by writing your tweet and then using the following hashtags. Hashtag Build Back Better, Hurricane Ida, and you can use the @ symbol for Sierra Club Delta and Earthworks. The congresspersons that we're going to be reaching out to are Julia Letlow, Clay Higgins, Troy Carter, Steve Scalise, Mike Johnson, Garrett Graves, and the senators are John Kennedy and Bill Cassidy. Now, this is where we really need to lean in on our out-of-state folks, y'all, for amplification. I know we do have a ton of Louisiana folks on the call, and that was the purpose of the call, but we can certainly have folks stand with us in solidarity while tweeting. And someone asked me privately, what exactly should you be tweeting? Because of course we have the hashtags on there. As we've discussed over the last few minutes on this call, from our stories to the pertinent information that Logan Burke gave us, feel free to use some of that language in your tweet to be able to add that hashtag as well as that @ symbol to make sure you are sending it to the appropriate person. And so for myself, I know I'm going to do a little bit of a story in mind. And so we can get creative. You don't have to post the same thing.
And y'all, just to kind of echo what Kate's saying, like you don't, and so we were really hesitant to tell y'all exactly what to say because it's your story. But just as an example, this is we said September 15th is the potential deadline. And so with that in mind, what do you want to see? Our legislator, we have between the 2 of us, we have Graves and we have Carter. So we will @ Carter and we will say, we want to see you build back better by prioritizing electrification, or we want to see you build back better by centering clean energy without the nuclear, or something, something along those lines. Kate, you're now co-host. And Kate will show you what hers looks like. And then that should be a good template. But honestly, lean into what you want to see from your legislator. And if you could meet with them, what would you be asking them right now during this final countdown of a week or at least a month? What do you want in that budget reconciliation bill? How do you want to respond to Ida for no more Idas? And if you follow Alliance for Affordable Energy, 771 Alliance, Earthworks, you'll see that we've been tweeting about this. You can retweet, you can use that as a foundation for your own tweets. Next, we're going to do emails. And so I had to, Kate, mute your laptop. I had to decide priorities. We had to decide priorities. And so we don't have everyone's email here because all of our legislators are not necessarily going to be a swing on this budget reconciliation. And we will have music for this portion. And honestly, y'all, we're winding down the night, our evening together is coming to an end. So this is our big move we are going to email our congressional leaders and senators, well, their staff in this case, for our target leaders, so our 2 senators that we want to at least know where we stand on the issues, we're going to email their staff. And as for the 2 congressional leaders that may be more swing on the budget reconciliation, or we know we have Carter as our Democrat, but we definitely want to be specific about what we want to see in the budget reconciliation bill. And me and Kate will be answering questions in the chat along with Logan and Charles. And so if you need help for the content, I'll be working on my email alongside you guys. I'm going to drop these email addresses in the chat. You're just emailing them, deadline September 15th, letting them know where you're emailing from. Are you in state, out of state? What does Louisiana mean for you? And then what does the budget reconciliation bill mean for you? Whether it's the clean energy component, the public transportation component, the recovery from hurricane component, what do you want to see in order to address climate change so there's less folks having to deal with Hurricane Ida for decades to come? We already know that we're in a really tough spot with climate change and the climate crisis right now, but it doesn't mean we have to be stuck in it endlessly. And so we need to get our leaders to know where our priorities lie. And again, like Kate said, for our out-of-state folks, thank you for joining in solidarity. If you can retweet, if you can email what you love about Louisiana or Louisiana's people, because I know you love us, just please do and let them know we really do want to address the climate crisis, because Louisiana, if we can address the climate crisis, then the world can address the climate crisis. We're so knee deep in oil and gas that if we can make changes, then everyone can make changes. All right, if you're still working on your email, keep working on your email, because if you're like me and you know that you start something and if you don't finish it, then you're not going back to it. You finish that email. Don't let me distract you. All right, so some quick housekeeping things. We do have a virtual meeting on tomorrow. So if folks are interested in meeting with Representative Julia Letlow's staff, 3 p.m. tomorrow, put it in the chat. We'll get you on that call. It's a Zoom call, of course. Everything's virtual. Most of our legislators are back in DC, our congressional leaders. We do have a meeting with Representative Carter's staff on Wednesday, September 15th at noon, talk about Under the Wire. And then we have already met with Graves staff, and we have a pending meeting for Wednesday afternoon with Representative Johnson's staff. If you are in any of these districts, if you know someone in any of these districts, please just have them email us, and I'll drop my email in the chat, or just put it in the chat and I'll reach out to you accordingly. We do prepare our folks. So we have agendas that are pretty standard for our calls. We have usually meet either 30 minutes before a call just to kind of run through how we want to kind of guide the conversation. And we have deliverables ready to go as well to our leaders. And we're not just going to throw you out there. So just keeping in mind, so September 15th to 17th-ish is the deadline for the budget reconciliation bill, but that could go way back to the 27th, depending on what happens with the budget ceiling and all of those debates. So for now, we have 3 days of action. So if you can call and email, if you can hop on a Zoom call with staff that we're scheduling, and hoping to get the rest of the leaders scheduled with their staff as well. If you can tweet daily, if you can hop on public transit, if you can walk around your town that's been impacted by Hurricane Ida, whatever it is that drives you to do this climate crisis addressing work, then please do it and make sure our leaders see that. So at them as you can, and you'll get this PowerPoint, so you'll have all the links. And then there's a pending webinar that we have with Secretary Wilson. He is the Secretary of the Department of Transportation and Development on September 22nd or later, just depending on where DOTD is in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. And if he's still able to meet with us at 6:30 p.m. that Wednesday. Regardless, we plan to keep that relationship going. We plan to have the long-term fight into legislative session next year, because we know that while it feels like a lot to juggle climate, energy, and also public transportation, these are all prongs and tactics for addressing the climate crisis. And so after September, which some people are now saying might go through the end of the year, so after this budget reconciliation and the bipartisan infrastructure bills are settled, we'll reassess and see where are our next tactics, or who else do we need to meet with in the state of Louisiana on parish level, local level, municipal level. And we just ask you for now to keep telling your story, keep really kind of thinking about what your story is, and then how do you want to use that to catalyze change? And what are we asking of our officials? What are you asking of your officials specifically? Because we can say address climate change, but we want to say this is how we want it done. And being specific is super important for holding accountable. So keep telling your story, keep demanding change in all spaces and at all levels of change. And more reading, as I said before, is in the chat. And if we don't have any questions, we can wrap up for the night. Thank y'all for spending your Sunday evening with us and for taking action and finishing those emails. We are so grateful for you doing that. Good night.